Today, we are analyzing the final cut and focus group data for a pivotal television episode where a fascist superhero seeks godhood, while his enemies and allies tear each other apart, searching for an immortality serum in a derelict lab.
Oh, please. Are we actually pretending this plastic-wrapped content has any genuine narrative engine?
Well, the macro-level narrative engine here relies on a tremendous amount of forward momentum, balancing this primary apocalyptic plot against...
Balancing? It's an algorithmic disaster. It's a corporate asset designed to keep shareholders awake.
Look, the pressure that production attempts to apply to the characters is immense, especially considering the apocalyptic stakes of that primary storyline. It's a very ambitious...
It's not ambitious. It's a mess.
Well, let's dig right into that pressure. Because a key theme running through this material is the concept of a ticking clock. But it feels like there are multiple clocks ticking at vastly different speeds.
Which is a polite way of saying the editing is TikTok-paced garbage.
In our A story, we have the virus, which needs weeks to multiply, cooking low and slow. Concurrently, Homelander and Soldier Boy are racing to Fort Harmony to find Compound V. If Homelander secures it, the world essentially ends.
Right, the audience is hyper-aware of that specific impending doom because the show won't stop screaming at them.
They are, but this high-octane thriller structure is intercut with Annie's deeply personal, isolated storyline. She has been removed from the main game board entirely.
Yeah, she's in a completely different show.
She's in a quiet suburban home, confronting her estranged father and his new family. We are literally watching scenes centered around offering Hamburger Helper and loading the washing machine, while the rest of the cast is staring down the barrel of Armageddon.
It's visual melatonin.
Well, as I understand it from the audience reception report, there was significant frustration on forums, with viewers labeling these scenes as, quote, pure filler.
Because they are.
I have to challenge the audience reception here, though. Doesn't a relentless thriller actually require a B story that breathes?
Oh, come on.
Does taking a major character entirely off the main board during a global crisis justify this level of viewer frustration? I mean, it's a brilliant subversion of...
Stop! The pacing of the narrative suffers significantly when the high-stakes primary mission is repeatedly interrupted by a disconnected, localized familial subplot.
I don't think it's disconnected at all. It's...
The weakness here is that the geographic and thematic isolation of Annie's storyline actively drains the momentum from that urgent race for the V1 serum.
It's character work.
It makes her emotional arc feel like a stalling tactic to the audience. It's not an essential piece of the episode's structural puzzle, it's pad. It is pure runtime padding to fit more mid-roll ad breaks.
I want to explore the mechanics of why you think that happens, because it reminds me of building a high-performance engine, but utilizing a cheap, brittle rubber band for the timing belt.
Exactly. The parts just don't sync up.
The audience is operating on a highly elevated thriller frequency, but the final cut violently shifts gears and asks them to tune into a grounded, domestic drama frequency. The cognitive load required to make that switch every 5 minutes is exhausting, which is why they perceive the slower scenes as filler, regardless of the emotional performance.
That cognitive dissonance is exactly what the audience is reacting to. In serialized television, especially this manufactured ESG superhero sludge, a B story simply cannot exist in a vacuum during an apocalyptic climax.
It has to reflect or challenge the A story.
It has to directly intersect with the overarching A story. When Annie is sitting in that living room, the audience isn't processing her trauma regarding her father's abandonment because their attention is focused on whether Homelander is about to breach the derelict lab.
The current production attempts to introduce tension when the younger stepbrother, Mason, calls a local deputy.
Right, because of an internet video?
The motivation provided is that Mason has been brainwashed by internet propaganda. He thinks Annie is a terrorist. That is certainly valid social commentary on media consumption.
It's lazy writing.
But it feels fundamentally disconnected from the immediate, pressing physical danger established in the rest of the episode.
The suggestion is to tightly intertwine the external stakes of the family drama with the immediate consequences of the main plot's overarching threat, maintaining narrative velocity across all scenes.
So how do we achieve that mechanically without losing the quiet, emotional core of Annie confronting her father? Because that acting is quite good.
By shifting the systemic reality of the world she is hiding in. For a concrete example, Instead of Annie's brother simply calling a local cop out of general prejudice or internet paranoia, have the local police actively enforcing Homelander's newly established Democratic Church of America mandates.
Oh, so the deputy isn't just a skeptical family friend responding to a domestic disturbance.
No.
He arrives as an active agent of the new fascist reality that Sister Sage and Firecracker are building in the primary storyline.
Precisely. If we make that adjustment, the stakes instantly translate across storylines.
Right, right.
If Annie is caught in this seemingly quiet suburban home, it is no longer just a personal failure or a localized arrest. It is a strategic disaster for the entire team fighting at Fort Harmony.
Which makes her escape critical, not just for her own emotional closure, but to prevent the local authorities from immediately alerting Vought to the broader team's vulnerabilities. The threat becomes entirely unified.
It fixes the product.
That binds the narrative architecture together beautifully. Every time the episode cuts away from the lab to Annie, the audience wouldn't feel like the brakes were being pumped.
They wouldn't be reaching for their phones.
They would feel the walls of Homelander's new world order closing in on her in real time. It validates her presence in the episode without sacrificing the adrenaline of the main plot.
And the macro-level control of the antagonist is felt even in the most micro-level domestic setting.
Which actually provides a perfect lens to examine our next issue. We just broke down how Annie is isolated by Vought's systemic, macro-level fascist control. I want to shift our focus to how that exact same corporate control is enacted on an individual physical level.
Oh, God, let me guess.
Let's look closely at the tonal consistency of the final edit, specifically the section detailing the confrontation between the Deep and Black Noir 2.
That is a fascinating sequence to unpack, mostly because it proves how desperate the studio is for a cheap laugh.
It's a huge moment. The Deep is absolutely furious about Noir's erratic actions. In response to being berated, Noir simply takes off his mask, entirely breaking his trademark silence, and reveals he is just a hired actor.
Cringe.
His terrifying silence isn't the result of some dark, sprawling conspiracy. It isn't a Vought cloning experiment gone horribly wrong. He explains he is just going full method to honor the deceased original Noir, complaining bitterly about how difficult it is to refrain from using his voice, which he pompously calls his most powerful instrument.
It fundamentally shifts the genre of the scene from psychological horror to workplace comedy. It's pathetic.
I want to defend this choice vigorously for a moment on behalf of the production team.
Of course you do.
This specific television universe is built upon a foundation of dark satire and aggressive meta-humor. The audience is primed for this. Isn't subverting a massive, brooding, Reddit-fueled fan conspiracy theory with a mundane, egotistical Hollywood actor joke exactly the kind of clever, self-aware subversion this specific audience craves?
Relying on a purely comedic, metatextual punchline to resolve a character mystery undermines the established dread and tonal consistency of the broader dystopian themes.
You think the subversion goes too far?
The weakness is that while the joke is undeniably a subversion of fan expectations, it completely deflates audience investment.
But it's funny.
It disrupts the horrifying, high-stakes atmosphere of an episode that is otherwise dealing with mind control, the pursuit of godhood, and deep generational trauma. A spoof beat in the middle of a horror thriller sequence shatters the reality of the world for a temporary laugh.
It's winking at the audience.
It winks at the camera, telling the audience, don't worry, the terrifying corporate antagonists are actually just incompetent, vain idiots. It's focus group Marvel tier quip trash.
I see the distinction you were drawing between a spoof and a satire. In this very episode, the overarching tone is aggressively grim. Oh Father is utilizing sonic powers to literally force a congregation into mindless religious ecstasy so Homelander can be worshipped as a deity.
Exactly. The stakes are massive.
Sister Sage is casually drafting policy to defund all public education.
True satire uses the established reality of the world to heighten the horror to an absurd logical extreme. To make the overarching threat of Homelander work, Vought needs to be perceived as a terrifying, soul-crushing machine.
Right.
When an actor takes off a mask and complains about his artistic process like he's sitting in a coffee shop in Burbank, it lowers those stakes to zero. It treats the product like a joke.
So how do we pivot a mundane Hollywood joke into something that functions as a surgical strike on the concept of corporate power?
The suggestion is to pivot the comedic reveal into something deeply unsettling that ultimately reinforces the grim reality of corporate exploitation within this universe.
Give me a concrete example.
We keep the actor's excuse that he is simply method acting. However, we reveal that his preparation involved the corporation forcing him to undergo actual traumatic lobotomization procedures to accurately match the original Noir's severe brain damage.
Oh, wow. That is a chilling adjustment.
It actually has teeth.
It takes the humor and immediately weaponizes it. The character is still complaining about his process, but the reality of what method acting means when an individual is legally owned by a monolithic, sociopathic pharmaceutical company is entirely different.
Exactly.
It demonstrates visually and conceptually that Vought views human brains, human identities, as entirely disposable commodities.
It turns a simple punchline into a terrifying commentary on what the corporation demands of its assets. Furthermore, we have to consider the character dynamics in the room.
With the Deep?
Yes. The Deep consistently relies on Noir as a silent sounding board to justify his own atrocities. If Noir is actually suffering from corporate-mandated surgical brain damage right in front of him, it reflects back on the Deep's own willful ignorance of the horrors happening around him.
Because he is literally talking to an empty vessel created by the company he serves.
Right. It forces the reality of the corporation into the room, instead of pausing for a comedy sketch.
That enriches the scene on multiple levels, far beyond a quick laugh at the audience's expense. We are preserving the initial intent, subverting the dark mystery of the character, but we are forcing the execution to align with the established, brutal tone of the universe.
It stops it from being a cartoon.
Now we've just discussed how corporate mandates strip Noir of his internal reality and his agency. I want to move to our final major structural point and look at how the core team's internal realities are brought to the surface.
Let's talk about the total lack of agency.
You are referring to the sequence at Fort Harmony.
The absolute lowest point of the product.
Now, the final edit makes a strong case for high-tension claustrophobia here. The core team finally arrives at the derelict lab, only to discover the V1 safe is already rusted and completely empty.
Right.
The immediate realization is that someone else, likely the old, disgraced hero bomb site, took the serum ages ago. But before the team can even process the magnitude of this failure, they are infected by toxoplasmosis rage spores released by a mutated feral soup named Quinn, who is guarding the facility.
The introduction of the lazy biological trigger.
Yes, and under the influence of these hallucinogenic sci-fi spores, the team violently airs their deepest, most toxic grievances. Huey lashes out at the absent Annie, accusing her of main character syndrome, and turns on Butcher, screaming about his destructive leadership.
Main character syndrome? Really? The dialogue is just ripped from Twitter.
Kimiko snaps at Frenchie, yelling at him for continually treating her like a fragile pet rather than a soldier. Now, I have to point out that the audience reception metrics explicitly note how much viewers loved this scene.
Viewers love bright colors and loud noises too.
They praise the emotional catharsis. My question to you is, if the destination is fantastic character development and a necessary clearing of the air, why should we police the vehicle? Does it really matter if a sci-fi biological trigger was used to open the floodgates?
Utilizing an external biological trigger to force internal character conflict risks making the emotional resolutions feel unearned and artificial.
Walk me through the mechanics of why it feels artificial if the emotions themselves are genuine.
The weakness is that relying on hallucinogenic rage spores acts as a massive narrative shortcut. It's practically an AI-generated plot device. It robs the characters of their agency in choosing to confront one another.
But they are confronting each other.
When the tension boils over, it feels like a symptom of a monster they are fighting, rather than the organic, inevitable result of the immense stress they have been under all season.
It fundamentally comes down to agency in drama. It's the psychological difference between someone hurling a devastating insult at you because they are heavily intoxicated versus someone delivering that exact same insult because they have finally reached their absolute breaking point while entirely sober.
Exactly. The intoxicated insult can be brushed aside the next morning. The sober insult carries permanent structural weight in the relationship.
That is the exact distinction. While the spores might be effective at creating immediate, visceral spectacle for the focus groups, long-term narrative trust relies entirely on character choices.
If Huey only possesses the courage to tell Butcher how much he resents him because a glowing mushroom told his brain to do it, it creates a massive narrative escape hatch.
Right. Butcher can easily dismiss the entire confrontation the next day. He can just wave it off as, "You were under the influence of the spores, mate."
He literally has an out. The production has given the characters permission to avoid taking responsibility for the emotional shrapnel they throw at each other.
So how do we fix it?
The suggestion is to dilute the influence of the external sci-fi device and anchor the explosive confrontation squarely in the immediate, tangible failure of their mission.
How do we restructure the scene to implement that? We still have Quinn in the facility as a physical threat.
For a concrete example, instead of the spores directly causing blind, uninhibited rage, let the devastating realization that the hero bomb site stole the V1 decades ago be the sole emotional catalyst.
Just the realization.
The team is trapped in an underground bunker. They know Homelander is minutes away from breaching the doors. They know the virus needs weeks to cook. Their one silver bullet, the only thing that could prevent the end of the world, has been gone for 40 years.
The sheer, crushing despair of that realization is more than enough to trigger a psychological breakdown. They don't need magic sci-fi spores to make them snap. They just need absolute hopelessness.
You can have the spores merely act as a mild physical claustrophobic irritant. Perhaps it makes their eyes water, makes it difficult to draw a full breath, elevates their heart rates.
Yeah.
But when Huey finally snaps and delivers those harsh, unforgiving truths about Butcher's toxic leadership and Annie's abandonment, it must be completely his own choice. It must be born from the despair of losing their only advantage.
That elevates the dialogue from a cheap sci-fi trope to prestige drama. When Huey looks at Butcher, a man who has repeatedly, mercilessly dragged this team through the mud, demanding blind loyalty, and realizes Butcher has led them into a dead end yet again, Huey's explosion is deeply earned.
Because he's not hallucinating.
He is seeing the reality of their situation clearly for the first time in months. And when Chemical tells Frenchie she isn't his pet to manage, it shouldn't be a side effect of toxoplasmosis. It must be a desperate, sober assertion of her own autonomy in the face of certain death.
I think there is also a profound thematic resonance to this change that even a focus group could understand.
What do you mean?
Consider the thematic through line of the entire season we discussed earlier. The villains, Vought, Homelander, Sister Sage, Oh Father, are all powerful entities utilizing external forces to strip everyday people of their free will.
Yes.
Oh Father uses sound waves to force religious worship. Sister Sage uses public policy to force ignorance. Homelander uses the threat of physical annihilation to force compliance.
Wait, I see exactly where you're going with this.
Do you?
If the narrative then uses biological spores to force our heroes to express their deepest emotions, the production is essentially utilizing the exact same manipulative tactics on their protagonists that the villains use on the public.
Exactly. By removing the mind control aspect of the spores from the core team, we grant them the one fundamental thing Homelander's victims do not have: the terrifying freedom to choose.
The freedom to choose their own destruction, or their own brutal honesty. I hadn't connected those thematic dots, but that is incredibly powerful.
It fixes the rot at the center of the episode.
That Quinn remain a physical obstacle for them to fight. Let the spores elevate the physical tension of the room. But the emotional detonations must belong entirely to Huey, Butcher, Chemical, and Frenchie. That way, when the dust finally settles and they manage to survive and have to look each other in the eye the next morning, the apologies and the reconciliations are rooted in genuine character growth.
It isn't just an antivirus wearing off.
It makes the emotional architecture of the entire back half of this season so much more robust. When Annie finally escapes her isolated storyline and returns to the main group, and she and Huey have to reconcile, he isn't just recovering from a drug trip. He is recovering from a moment of profound, undeniable vulnerability.
Right, it grounds the heightened reality of the superhero genre in deeply recognizable human psychology, instead of treating the audience like they need keys jingled in their faces.
Well,
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, dissecting the underlying structural mechanics of this final cut.
If you want to call it that.
To quickly recap our 3 actionable takeaways for the showrunners. First, tightly intertwine your isolated subplots with the main ticking clock, ensuring that secondary arcs like Annie's family drama are directly pressured by the macro-level threat to maintain narrative velocity.
Otherwise, it's just filler.
Second, ground your meta-humor in the universe's dark reality. Pivot comedic reveals like Noir's method acting into chilling examples of corporate horror rather than tension-deflating spoofs.
Stop writing quips.
And third, allow character tension to boil over organically from the despair of failure rather than relying on external plot devices like rage spores, ensuring that emotional catharsis is earned through true character agency. I invite the creators to implement these tweaks and submit their next batch of content for...
Don't bother submitting anything else. If you have to rely on cheap lobby group nostalgia, algorithmic padding, and literal magic mushrooms to make your characters talk to each other, you aren't making television. You're just packaging industrial waste and hoping the shareholders don't notice the smell. We're done here.